Our next speaker knows all about fairy tales. We're talking the gory, shocking, fascinating stories that Disney scrubs clean for our nation's children. She is a science freelance writer, but we best know her from her awesome podcast called Tabled Fables. Please welcome Sophie Bushwick.
The mother of all hair stories. So the story starts out when a pregnant woman gets a real craving for vegetables. So these vegetables might be, there's a whole category on stock photo for those. So the vegetable might be cabbage, it could be parsley, or it could be the leafy green rampion, better known as Rapunzel. Because they thought that denying a pregnant woman's cravings could cause miscarriage and bad luck, either the woman or her husband decide to steal some from the garden next door, which unfortunately belongs to a witch or a fairy or an ogress, and she catches them in the act and makes them trade their unborn child for the greens. The witch raises the child as her own, and when she reaches puberty, the witch locks her away in a tower where the only means of entry and exit is by climbing up her long hair. A prince finds out about her and tricks her into thinking that he's the witch, climbs up the hair, and in many versions of the story, they have a secret marriage at this point. In other ones, they just begin meeting regularly. Let's talk the secret marriage ones, though, because hanky-panky ensues, and there are inevitable results. So the witch finds out about the relationship, and she punishes both parties. Rapunzel gets a haircut and is exiled to the wilderness, where she gives birth to twins. The prince is thrown or forced to jump from the tower and blinded, but after much suffering, the lovers reunite, and Rapunzel's tears heal the prince's blindness, and they return to his kingdom. So where does this story come from? Cultures all over the world have stories about ladies walled up in towers, and they've been telling them for hundreds and hundreds of years. In 1634, the Italian fairy tale collector Giambattista Basile recorded a very influential story called Petronella, which shares a lot of the key features of a Rapunzel story, but has a completely different ending. It did, however, influence the first version of Rapunzel to have the plot that we know and love. It was the French story Percinet. Like the earlier story Petronella, Percinet gets her name from the parsley that her mother craves, but the author of the tale, Charlotte Rose de la Force, she changed the tale in some very rebellious ways, and to see what she was rebelling against, you really have to understand the context when she wrote the tale. So in 17th to 18th century France, there were a lot of gender barriers for women. They were restricted in education, in their finances, in their physical independence, and in their choice of husband. A woman's looks were her greatest asset, and a big part of that was her hair. Around this time, some fashionable hairstyles came into vogue that required wires and a lot of time to put ornaments up, and they started getting larger and more of a burden. So we'll come back to the hair in a minute, but for the upper-class women who wanted a more intellectual life, they started hosting literary salons where men and women could discuss the issues of the day, and they began a vogue for retelling folk tales about the mid-17th century. Before that, they thought folk tales were just vulgar peasant stories, but it became the fad for these intellectuals to rewrite them. The term fairy tale comes from Madame d'Aulnoy, who published a collection entitled Contes de Fées. And although most fairy tale authors were women, the most famous one was Charles Perrault, a man. You might not know his name, but you certainly know the tales he wrote, which included Puss in Boots, Red Riding Hood, Cinderella, and so on. If you read the original version of these tales, you'll see that he ends them with a moral, usually a poem at the end of the story. And Perrault wasn't the only French author to add moral lessons to his retellings. The original folk tales were filled with raunchy jokes. They weren't necessarily for children. But the literary ones added elements of social critique and moral lessons for children and young women. So if you're a young woman facing an arranged marriage, you can look to Beauty and the Beast and learn that being kind, accepting, and submissive can turn even the most beastly bridegroom into a prince. Many of these tales were about teaching women to be obedient. If the girls disobey and stray from the path, it's their fault, and they are the ones who are punished. So, for example, the version of Red Riding Hood written by Charles Perrault ends immediately after the wolf eats Red. There's no rescuer. Because she allowed the metaphorical man to distract her and hoodwink her into bed, Red dies, and the wolf gets off scot-free. I don't think Charlotte Rose de la Force would approve of Red's fate because she often strayed from the path of propriety. Charlotte joined the court of Louis XIV when she was only 16. She wrote novels and stories and earned a writer's pension, and she was a very self-determined woman who naturally attracted a lot of scandals. So, for example, she was engaged to a nobleman and then caused a fuss when she gave him a pouch filled with toads' feet and spells. They got married anyway, but the marriage was later annulled. She also had a long affair with a much younger man named Charles de Brieux. His family locked him away to prevent them from eloping. But in order to sneak into his father's castle and see him, she dressed up as a dancing bear and came in with a troupe of performers. They married in secret, but their families had this marriage annulled as well. And then in 1697, Charlotte attracted some real trouble and was exiled from court, both for her satirical poetry and for the rumors that she was having yet another affair with the heir to the French throne. She was walled up in an abbey, and it was there that she wrote her fairy tale collection Contes de Contes, including the story of another imprisoned woman, Percinet. As you might expect from a lady like Charlotte, the moral lessons she put in Percinet were very different from the ones in other literary fairy tales. So, when writers adapted tales, they often changed the gender roles from the previous versions of the story. So, for example, early versions of Puss in Boots had the resourceful cat be a female, but when Charles Perrault wrote it down, he made it a male, and it's remained male ever since. In Percinet, it's the mother who craves some kind of salad, but it's the father who agrees to give away their daughter after he's caught stealing parsley. This is a change from the earlier Italian version of the story, where it's the mother who gives away the child. So switching the blame from the female to the male parent doesn't seem like a huge deal, but it was incredibly unusual in these tales. It's the opposite of what usually happens. So usually in stories where the father gives away his children, so Hansel and Gretel, Beauty and the Beast, The Armless Maiden, later adaptations bend over backwards to take the blame off of him. They have him coerced or tricked by a stepmother, or they have the daughter offer to sacrifice herself. So in Perrault's story Donkey Skin, a father actually wants to marry his own daughter, but according to Perrault, it's because he promised his dead wife before she passed away. Well, he didn't promise to marry the daughter, but it's her fault anyway. Instead of taking the blame off the dad and sticking it on the mother figure, Charlotte takes the blame off mom and sticks it on dad. Punishment, like blame, also depends on an offender's gender in most fairy tales. So in Percinet, the fairy who has custody of our protagonist sees she's pregnant and she's outraged, cuts off Percinet's hair, takes her to an isolated spot by the seaside, but there's a freshwater brook, and there's a magical basket that's constantly refilled with biscuits, so Percinet has anything she wants to eat. It's here that she gives birth to twins, and she lives a decent, if isolated, life. Prince, on the other hand, is forced to throw himself from the tower, and he's blinded. He gets to wander alone in the wilderness, eating roots and herbs. And this uneven punishment does make sense if you think about it, because the prince is a young man of the world, whereas Percinet is so innocent she doesn't even realize what it means when she becomes pregnant. But in other literary fairy tales, when a couple's punished for having sex, the woman always gets the worst deal. Just look at Red versus the wolf. Charlotte clearly thought that when it came to sexual misconduct, the male should share both blame and punishment. So the other change that she makes in Percinet is changing the antagonist from an evil ogress to a fairy, who's strict but not evil. She eventually forgives the couple and returns them to the palace of the prince's father. Because of this change, she's more of a parental figure as opposed to an enemy. But this gives us a story with three bad parents. There's Percinet's mother, whose rapacious craving for parsley gets everyone in trouble. There's her father, who steals and gives her away before she's even born. And then there's the fairy, who thinks the best way to protect this girl from the world during puberty is to wall her up in a giant phallic symbol. Instead of presenting the lesson that parents know best and children should obey them, Charlotte's telling us that parents are fallible. The woman who defied her family's wishes, who dressed up as a dancing bear, she wouldn't put too much stock in obedience, and neither does Percinet. So if you fast forward to the 2010 adaptation of Rapunzel called Tangled, the Disney movie, does it keep these rebellious aspects of the tale? Well, it takes a lot of liberties with the plot, but there's one rebellion that does remain, and that's showing what a burden that magnificent hair is. So in Personette, this hair is a symbol of her incarceration. It's the only way to get in and out of the tower, and she can't use it to escape since it's attached to her head. It's not until the fairy chops off her hair that she can leave. So Entangled, spoilers, Rapunzel does leave the tower with her hair intact, but it has to be carted around everywhere, and it's constantly getting in the way. Unless, of course, she has help braiding it up. Also entangled, as you saw in previous presentations, the act of slicing off Rapunzel's hair ultimately destroys her captor. In Charlotte de la Force's tale and in the modern retelling, haircuts lead to freedom, while hair itself is a burden. It's no coincidence that hair also symbolizes female beauty. In 17th century France, and unfortunately still today, the value of a woman was and is tied to her external appearance. This creates an obligation to look good at all times, which is as restrictive and as frustrating as carting around yards and yards of hair. So you can't blame our rebellious Rapunzel and Personette, for wanting to just get a damn haircut, and in the words of another Disney princess, let it go.
Another hand for Sophie Bushwick with all those French pronunciations. That was amazing.